Those of you who've joined before would know that I often start with a particularly favorite quote of mine from Pope Benedict XVI, and which speaks in a very important, perceptive way to the world of advocacy. In the only bit of intensely social writing that Pope Benedict did, called Caritas in Veritate, Charity in Truth, in paragraph 78, he has that very insightful paragraph. He says, I just want to get to it. There we go. As we contemplate the vast amount of work to be done, we are sustained by our faith that God is present alongside those who have come together in his name to work for justice as a joyful task to be accomplished in a spirit of solidarity. As we contemplate the vast amount of work to be done, we are sustained by our faith that God is present alongside those who come together in his name to work for justice, a joyful task to be accomplished in a spirit of solidarity. Benedict, in that paragraph, gives us the basis of sound, good, solid. If we look at it for a moment and think about it, we can see the elements of that advocacy very clearly. Next slide, please. Firstly, it's a task that we must engage in. For those of you who are versed in the kind of theology and spirituality of Catholic social teaching, you will remember that line of Pope Paul VI in the letter Justice in the World, chapter 6, where he speaks quite forthrightly about engaging in the work for justice and the liberation of the world from all oppressive structures. And he says that that is a constituent element of preaching the gospel. In other words, Pope Paul VI is very clear. If we are not working for justice, if we're not advocating for a world that is free of oppression and all the things that dehumanize people, then some core definition of our Christianity, of our Christian identity is missing. We're not truly Christian if we are not doing work for justice. And so it is a question of faith. It's part of what we are baptized into. We're baptized into the transformation of the world. It's an element of our faith. Thirdly, it's always done with others. Again, if I might sound a deep theological point, we work with an understanding of our faith as being what some people call communitarian. In other words, we have a lens of community through which we do our theology. We know that from our understanding of the Trinity. It's three persons in community. And so all our theology is done with that idea of what is best for the community, not what is best for me, but what is best for the community. And so it's always relational. It's always done with others. It's always done with others in mind. I think in Africa, we know it well because it is so close to our understanding of Ubuntu. Fourthly, it's always about justice, not about charity. Charity has its place, and we can't overlook it. But when we do advocacy in the mind and the heart and the theological tradition of our church, we're doing it for justice. St. Augustine once said that charity is no substitute for justice withheld. And I think in terms of our topic of environmental justice, of the Laudato Si spirituality, we need to bear in mind that, and as advocates in Africa, we need to bear in mind that only 4% of all the world's emissions come from Africa. But Africa also has some of the highest number. 4 out of the 10 countries most affected by climate change are in Africa. So it's not just a matter of smoothing things over in our advocacy for environmental justice. It's a matter of justice. And the final point that I think Benedict makes is that it's done in solidarity. And that is very clear in our understanding of the environment. It is an interconnected reality. It's interconnected, it works one part together with others. And so we're not just talking in this instance about the solidarity of us as advocates for a world free of oppression and dehumanization, but we are working in a spirit of solidarity, of relationships with all the ecosystems of the world, recognizing our dependency. So those points are very clear in Pope Benedict's very good understanding of the question and trying to work towards a definition of advocacy. So bear that in mind. You can also see in it his emphasis on contemplation, that we need a prayerful look at things, a sense of God, and that tradition within it. So there are many points for advocacy that are contained in that one paragraph of Caritas in Veritate. Thank you. The next slide, please. That slide I'm not really going to speak to in any length. I put it up simply as a reminder of the multiple ways in which this topic of environment also touches on all the other key signs of the time. The way in which it's integrally related to issues of poverty, of displacement of people, of the dehumanization of children and children's rights, the vulnerability of refugees and migrants, and the destruction of the ecosystem. So each of those bullet points are points that speak to the interconnectedness of the destruction that we are bringing about through our disregard and our devaluing of the of this planet and this common home, as Pope Francis has called it. So I simply put that up as a reference for future work, but with the real hope that it will remind us of the absolute interconnectedness of all the other dynamics in society that are dehumanizing people, making people vulnerable, marginalizing people, keeping the poor poor. So I simply put that up as a reminder of the interconnectedness. Next slide, please, Kelly. So what are the key issues? If you read across the vast amount of literature that is available on this topic, both in the faith tradition and in the broader tradition, there's just no end to the amount of literature that's coming out on this topic and on advocacy in particular. And so one can distill from that literature, one can distill some of the key events that are happening, some of the key phenomena, that might be a better word, the key phenomena that's taking place in our world that is really changing, and almost always for worse, some of some aspects of the face of the earth. And so from all the literature, I've highlighted these 6 or 7 points. We see it in the melting of glaciers, which will change water levels, it will change the nature of the Arctic and Antarctic, it will do all sorts of things. And that's one of the key areas that is a sign of the time and a sign of the dysfunction of our environmental process at the moment. The same is true of rising sea levels, the difficulties around places like the Maldives, flooding, which we've seen in this last year all over the world. Seen it from Mozambique to Germany, flooding with tremendous devastation, and the impact of that on livelihoods, on the economy, on human settlement, and even on national safety. So we are looking at phenomena with vast social impacts, and therefore key in our advocacy attempts. Increasing droughts, same as can be said for the droughts as for the flooding. The impact is huge. The increasing tornadoes, worsening food insecurity, not just for the reasons that we've always known, where there's injustice, where some people have too much to eat and waste while other people have nothing, but the nature of the soil, the nature of the growth environment for food is also changing. And so where specific variety of food grew abundantly and became the staple of some communities, that is now simply disappearing. And communities are left destitute and with high levels of food insecurity. And then the rise of pests and diseases. A fascinating article as I was reading for this webinar, for this presentation, on how the lack of water in certain places and the rising drought that is often companion to that phenomena is allowing all sorts of insects to re-emerge and to double their production rate, and so that more devastation is caused by the insects than would have been the case if there had been a regular flow of water and the normal cycle of life took place. So those are the key advocacy areas that most international organizations and advocacy practitioners are looking at. And therefore, there are also areas for our consideration as we act in partnership and concert with other organizations. And I think just looking, a number of our colleagues on this call this morning are from dioceses, and to look at which of those phenomena are the key phenomena in your area and what the social and economic and even political consequences of that is, because it's there that we find the cost of environmental destruction. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yes, just a few thoughts that are key to how we do advocacy, particularly around the faith dimension, which, as I said earlier, is a demand for justice. So just to bear in mind that amongst the countries most affected by climate change, the following are in the top 15 or so, and they're all in Africa. I mean, these are all in Africa, and you know, it's like a third of the top 15 countries that are devastated and do not have the capacity through natural phenomena or through financial possibility of adapting to the drastic changes. It's Chad, Somalia, Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Eritrea. And they are the countries least able to make those drastic kind of changes that the climate change phenomena has foisted on them. And yet they're the countries that almost produce nothing towards the carbon emissions and other social sins that are part of the devastation of our planet. And just as a matter of interest, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, South Sudan, and Niger are following in a similar direction. And that information is found very freely on the Global Climate Index. Just to make the point, I think, there, that the urgency of advocacy for us is that many of these countries are our neighboring countries. And what affects one ultimately affects all. And I think, again, in a theology of advocacy, one looks at these phenomena through a lens of disruption. They're disrupting, as I said earlier, social human settlements. They're disrupting productivity. They're disrupting food security. They're disrupting political stability, population movement. There's now a phenomenon called climate refugees, people who are leaving their places of birth or of long settlement, not because of war or violence or persecution, but because of the drastic changes that climate change has brought to them. Just I think sometimes statistics give us a real sense of the violence and the disruption of what we are going through at the moment. And so just a pause for thought. 750 million children in 45 countries stand to be profoundly adversely affected by climate change. What are we saying? Climate change, if you see it as a phenomena that's causing refugees, means that children are going to be on the move, therefore will not access stability and will not access stable education. They will be in situations of food insecurity. They will be in situations of drought and flooding, all things that make human settlement difficult, that make stable childhood difficult. And that kind of number is just alarming, to say the least, and therefore must be a cause of great urgency for us to do advocacy. I've said this before in the previous slide, but just, bearing in mind that in this slide I've focused in on the need for urgent advocacy in Africa, and the sense of disruption that this is causing, which is the exact opposite to the theological concept of communitarianism or fellowship that is at the heart of our way of thinking, and therefore a key point for us in our advocacy. Just again, the key impacts: weather patterns, water supply and the quality of water, agriculture. Sorry, I got the word impact somehow with a bracket there. Agriculture and droughts, the impact on human health, the impact on shelter, the impact on vulnerable populations. So I think if you look at what is happening in the faith community around advocacy, you will see lots of advocacy around issues of water, lots of advocacy around food security, lots of advocacy, particularly in the light of the pandemic, around human health, and lots of advocacy around shelter. So that is just to kind of focus the geography of needs and situate it in the physical geography, and then again to highlight what are the key signs of the time and where, with good basis, good theological and scientific basis, the key advocacy in environmental change is happening. So next slide, please, Kelly. Just something that many people are not aware of, that in the year 2008, which is quite a time back now, the church introduced 7 new deadly sins. You know, we know the deadly sins of the past, but the church has introduced 7 new deadly sins, and I am pretty sure that most people have never heard of it, and yet they speak directly into the work that we who are practitioners of justice and peace do. And so I thought I would just, and of course, it speaks to the topic that we have at the moment, that we are considering. The 7 new deadly sins are polluting, genetic engineering, drug dealing, being obscenely rich, abortion, pedophilia, and causing social injustice. Just maybe for a moment, consider how this affects our theology. We know about some areas of deadly sins, and how, you know, in the old church definition, they separate us from God. That's why they're deadly. But just think of it, how easily our culture feeds into so many of these areas of contemporary deadly sins. And how it interests me that almost nobody that I know has ever heard of them. And so the question for those of us who work in justice and peace commissions and in advocacy and in church structures is to ask how we have allowed such an important expansion of our moral theology to go unheeded, or maybe to ask why it's gone unheeded. Next slide, please, Kelly. Core aspects of theology with regard to the environment. Therefore, you know, what are the key theological aspects that we bring into our advocacy? What's the matrix of our advocacy in this area? Firstly, And it's interesting, these are theologically common sense. I mean, they're not rocket science in any way. But these were, I took them with some other borrowings from a book on called the 10 Commandments of Environment, which is a look at some of the writings of Pope Benedict. And it was published before Laudato Si, but look at some of the theological issues which he raised in some of his talks and sermons and speeches, and in some of the writings on the issues of environment, which was the area he most contributed to in terms of social teaching. So human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, set over creation in a spirit of responsibility, not domination. We know that from Genesis. Nature must not be reduced to a utilitarian object of manipulation, nor must it be absolutized or placed above human dignity. So we've got to locate it within the tradition of the Genesis narrative if it's to produce the balance in the way in which we live. That is so important. The notion of ecological responsibility, and that it involves the entire planet in a common duty to respect the environment as a collective good for present and future generations. I think for those especially working in justice and peace, the notion of collective good or social good has been a key component of the work in justice and peace, and of the thinking around the common good in theology after the Second Vatican Council. So it's again part of that communitarian vision. What affects us as a whole, not just me as an individual? What benefits us as a whole, and not just me as an individual? And the writings on the environment have been particularly clear, clearer than in Catholic social teaching before that. They've been particularly clear that our obligation is not only to the present. Much of our thinking in Catholic social teaching has been about how can we be just in this moment to everyone. The environmental theology has raised the question of future generations. You know, how do we bequeath an earth, a planet, to future generations that's fit for purpose? In dealing with environmental problems, ethics and human dignity should come before technology. I think we know that from within the natural law tradition of theology, and which shaped a lot of our earlier advocacy work in the church's tradition, that human dignity comes before any other area of improvement or area of kind of utilitarianism, expediency in all of this. So can I go to the next slide, please, Kelly? The next slide continues this list of very critical, the critical theological matrix of what we are, of our theology in our advocacy work. Nature is not a sacred or divine reality removed from human intervention. The human intervention that modifies some characteristics of living things is not necessarily wrong, as long as it respects their place in the ecosystem. So some things in the normal course of events change, we modify them, use them in other ways, curtail things, but as long as it keeps the balance in the ecosystem, that is critical. And then a question that many in Africa and in Asia have given a lot of thought to, and there's a huge amount of writing on this. The politics of development must be coordinated with the politics of ecology, and every environmental cost in developing projects must be weighed carefully. So it's another way of doing advocacy in a related way. You can't simply do advocacy for development and say development at all costs. You can't simply do advocacy and say we need job creation at all costs without taking into account the impact on the environment. And that more coherent approach is part of the politics of development that the church offers. Anyone who's read Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti will see that that's very clear in the theology that underlines that. And then again, Laudato Si's big contribution to theology. The ending of global poverty is directly related to the environment. You know, the subtitle of the encyclical is Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. So the things of the earth are to be shared justly. That is a key. Those again who work in the area of justice and peace know it as one of the key principles of justice and peace, the universal destination of goods. The right to clean and safe environment needs to be protected through international cooperation and accords. I think the representative will talk on that on Thursday, because it's a key area of what the Vatican is doing. And environmental protection requires a change in lifestyle, and it's a change which we know is a move from a consumerist mindset to one of responsibility. And to make the point clearly, it's a personal change as well as a social change that is called for. And then the last point I make on this slide, and the last point in this matrix of considerations that we need to bear in mind if our advocacy is going to remain faithful to our theology as well as progressive for our cause. The third is that it requires a spiritual response, a sense of God, and the God who has given and placed creation and the responsibility for it in our hands. That notion that Benedict XVI gives of as we contemplate, in the definition I gave at the beginning, he starts off that paragraph with as we contemplate. So it's a particularly spiritual outlook that we have as we continue this advocacy process. So friends, that's the theological matrix. Those are the considerations that we have to bear in mind when we do advocacy. And let me say, and I'm probably saying it to people who know this very well, but let me say that when we bear these things, these bullet points in mind, we actually create a coherent approach to the advocacy, but we also, and this is important, we also bring the value add that we as people of faith are uniquely able to bring. People bring their advocacy from various perspectives, and they add value adds. And if you look through these bullet points, they constitute our value add as people of faith to the advocacy that we are doing. May I have the next slide, please? Just a little reminder that in advocacy from a faith-based perspective, whether it be about just economics or just environment or migrants and refugees or the rights of indigenous people, the key basis or the key starting point or the core of our spirituality is, and therefore of our advocacy, is that we begin with the acknowledgement that we analyze and we advocate out of a position of solidarity with those who suffer and those who are vulnerable. J.B. Metz, the very famous German theologian, said we must acknowledge, resist, and remove suffering. And the other quotes are in the same line, but just to say that when we're doing advocacy, and when we're doing advocacy around this area of the creation, we've always got to ask, what does it say and how does it affect, and how is our solidarity with the most marginalized reflected in our advocacy? So I think it's a critical point and one that I don't want us to let go of. Slightly different to the other aspects of the matrix that we were looking at as holding our advocacy, but very much a part of it. So just bear that in mind very consciously. We do advocacy from the position of those who suffer and are vulnerable. And I think, again, for people who work in justice and peace, we know it well from our fundamental option for the poor. That key area of justice and peace in this area is also very critical. Thank you. The next slide, please. This is an insight of Bernstein, the sociologist, which I always use in my reflections on advocacy, because I think it really captures the kind of space that we occupy and what we want to bring in, what we want to contribute to that space. So it's almost like, what is the furniture of this room of advocacy? What do we want to have present in it so that it functions optimally? And Bernstein says, we need to create those types of spaces in which people come together, debate, can encounter each other in formation, in clarification, and the testing of opinions, where judgment, deliberation, pronesis, community wisdom can flourish. And I think, if you think about it, that's exactly what we want to do in our advocacy attempts. We want to create spaces of conversation. And in this environment, advocacy, many who work in the area have seen, for instance, the wisdom that community wisdom brings, the remedies that older people talk about, the cultural remedies, the cultural insights that people have. But we also want to clarify ideas. We want to refine ideas, and we need those spaces. So this is a very important quote. If you're looking and saying, well, what is it that we do? You know, we know what the matrix is for faith-based. We know where the starting point is. We know all the things that we've covered, what the key signs of the time are. But in this space, what's the kind of furniture we need to have if the room is to be usefully utilized? And I think this slide gives us that. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I've just added this slide because I think a lot of the advocacy, as Mike said at the beginning, for the environment has come through the very active work that Pope Francis has done. And so I just added this slide to prompt us and to prod us maybe a little more, and to say that in people like John Allen, the journalist who writes quite a lot on Pope Francis, says that there are two elements that Pope Francis has brought into the kind of more refined advocacy that the church was involved in. The one is social activism, especially direct and concrete forms of service. And the other is to give agency to those who are affected. In other words, to let the poor speak for themselves, to let those who are dispossessed by environmental greed speak for themselves, make contributions to the solutions, the whole world of agency. That is very important. And the Pope is saying, I think if anybody reads his work, his encouragement to social activism and the encouragement around agency is really very clear. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Yes, I just, at this point in having looked at all the elements, all the constituent elements of this faith-based advocacy, just to kind of start drawing it a bit to a close, all contemporary writing would look and say, where do we get our theology from in this area? And obviously, there are four areas: the Bible and the tradition of scripture, reason, the natural law, official documents of the church, and the experience of the pastoral cycle or circle. And those are the ways in which we certainly since Vatican II, but before that also, but certainly since Vatican II, have been the kind of tools that we use for people who are interested in church documents. The documents reflect this, especially from the document Octogesima Adveniens, the 80th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, is very clear on a lot of this. And then I simply offer you two, in the light of everything I've said, I simply offer you two definitions of advocacy. They are both very useful in their own way, and they complement each other. And you'll have the time to look at them. I want to leave some time for questions and answers and insights. So just have a look at them. They are both very, very useful. I have found them useful over the years. Thank you. Next slide, please. Again, just something for you to read, especially around the idea that advocacy in the faith community is dialogical. We achieve it through dialogue. We enter into dialogues. We speak to others and grow from that encounter with each other. And it's just three quotes from very different continents, from Africa, from the United States, and from India. Three people in very different intellectual formations. Amartya Sen, you will remember, was the Nobel Prize winner for economics. David Tracy is a theologian, and Tom Lodge is a political scientist. So yeah, just to keep in mind for those moments when you just wanting some support for your argument that this is a mainly dialogical exercise. Can I have the next slide, please, Kelly? Or may I have it, rather? Again, let me just point out a mistake at the end of the first quote about citizenship and preparing people for active interested participation. It's not Selinsky, it should be S. Alinsky, Saul Alinsky, but I'll change it before we send it out. And so Alinsky asks the question, you know, we know what we want to do when we do advocacy, what we want to get achieve. We saw those comments of Bernstein and others, but what is it? How do we engage the people in this process? And he says we do advocacy also so that we can have an informed, active, participating, interested people. And the more people are equipped to participate, the better and the more far-reaching our advocacy is. Then just 3 little points at the end of it, again, a little theological summary almost. All our church teaching talks about public. In other words, they're talking about citizens who reflect, engage, and deliberate and choose representatives. If we had a lot of time, I would encourage you, or we could have gone through, and I still encourage you to look at the church document, Gaudium et Spes. I think it's 45 that talks about this. Theology in the public domain is not so much apologetic, but hermeneutical. In other words, we don't try in theology, in advocacy, to explain how the Holy Trinity works, how 3 persons can be in one, and 1 person in 3, and how they are equal but different. That's the job for other areas of theology. We look at that theology of the Trinity, and we say, how does that theology translate into the kind of social work that we do? And so we say, well, that theology says if all 3 persons in the Trinity are equal, then it means all people are equal. And if all people are equal, all people have human rights. And so our looking at theology is what is called in theology hermeneutical. In other words, interpreting it, understanding it, applying it, rather than apologetics, which tries to give an argument for it. And then, as I said several times in this reflection, it's a communitarian vision, like Ubuntu, of reality. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes, just a quote of Robert Kennedy, which he part of a speech he gave in Cape Town in the midst of the worst years of apartheid, and he spoke about, you know, not all of us can change history, but we can all make our contribution, and it's like a ripple effect. The little contributions build up into a mighty wave, and I think that's the encouragement, because sometimes the work of advocacy can be very hard and very difficult and shows no immediate results. And we have to, the little efforts, they all are little ripples that build a great wave of change. And so just as an encouragement. With that, I'm going to close this reflection. Thank you for your patient listening, and hope that you have some contributions to make. Not really only a question and answer, few minutes, but you all come out of an experience of doing theology in the field of advocacy. And so I'd be really interested and inspired to hear your contributions. Thank you very much.